Sacramento is the capital of the American state of California. In 1991, it was a dangerous place where hundreds of murders were reported each year. Investigating them was more challenging than today, but it was this difficult task that Detective John Cabrera dedicated his life to. He didn't yet know that he would soon face an investigation that would be followed with unprecedented interest across the country. On March 7th, he was called to a very quiet neighborhood, mainly inhabited by retirees. The victim was 58-year-old Philip Inhofer. Philip was a former military man who had been working at the McClellan Air Force Base as a civilian. His son, Henry Inhofer, called the police. Henry was called by his father's boss, informing him that his father hadn't shown up for work. As a former military man, Philip rarely ever showed up late, let alone failed to show up at all. Hence, Henry immediately went to find out what had happened. He discovered the body in a small storage room. It was a horrifying sight. Philip was naked and lying face down, covered in blood. His head was tightly wrapped in a white plastic bag. John and his team didn't need much time to understand that Philip wasn't killed in the storage room where his son found him. The shredded shower curtain and blood on the bathroom walls indicated that the attack began there. Philip was taking a shower when the attacker lunged at him with a knife. His glasses were lying on the sink, meaning he didn't even have time to put them on. The initial knife strikes didn't kill Philip, and numerous defensive wounds on his arms indicated that he fought for his life. He even managed to exit the bathroom and push the attacker into another room, but was eventually overpowered. The assailant inflicted 32 strikes on Philip with 2 knives, one of which broke and got lodged in the victim's chest. After that, the assailant grabbed something heavy and struck the man's head so hard that blood splattered onto the ceiling. Then he placed a bag over the victim's head, tied it, and moved Philip into the storage room. Whoever did this had to possess exceptional strength to overpower a sturdy man, a former military man at that, and then move his body. The murder occurred in a very quiet neighborhood, and John Cabrera was not mistaken in assuming that someone should have heard something. A neighbor living across the street from Philip recounted that on the 5th, he and his wife were at home. Suddenly, the usual quiet of the night was disturbed by loud, rhythmic thuds. He decided to investigate the source of the noise. The man stepped out of his house and headed toward the sound. The thuds were coming from Philip's house, but they quickly ceased, and the lights went out. The neighbor thought that Philip might have been exercising, and the sound could have been weights being dropped on the floor. But the detective realized the neighbor heard Philip's murder when the assailant was striking him on the head. Therefore, the crime took place late at night on the 5th, around midnight. However, the motive for the crime remained unclear. It was unlikely to be a robbery since none of the drawers in the house were pulled out, and all the valuable items were left untouched. A possible clue was provided by Henry. He noticed that his father's car was missing. It was a Mercedes, always parked under the carport at home, with an original license plate with the numbers 36. Could the car have been the motive for the crime? Another thing in the victim's house drew attention. There was a note on the bedside table in the bedroom with a phone number and the name Jade Cabading. Obviously, Jade played some role in the victim's life if Philip carefully kept her number. However, none of the man's relatives and friends had ever heard of her. Who could this mysterious woman be, whom he kept hidden from everyone? In this matter, there were far more questions than answers. Any investigator knows that how a person lived often gives a clue as to how they died. That's why John began to study the victim's personal life. There were no reasons to suspect the man's family. Henry didn't often see his father while growing up because he was a military man, stationed in Korea, then Vietnam, then Thailand. But when Philip retired and moved to Sacramento, it allowed the men to develop their relationship. Philip lovingly cared for his son and granddaughter, spending a lot of time with them. He was a very gentle, kind, generous man, always ready to help. However, even though he led a quiet life, Philip Inhofer wasn't a recluse and enjoyed spending time with colleagues, attending square dancing. Then it wasn't enough for him, and he decided to add some vibrant colors to his life. He bought a red Mercedes, but he didn't stop there. For some reason, he was attracted to girls who worked in the escort industry. Henry learned about this when he found the corresponding brochure in his father's house. The police began to understand that the name on the bedside table might be related precisely to this aspect of the victim's life. John asked around the streets of the city, but no one knew anything about Jade Cabading. While studying Philip's phone calls, John Cabrera noticed that one number had no relation to the victim. So he simply dialed that number and directly asked the man who answered what his phone was doing on the call list of the deceased person. Additionally, he inquired if the man knew Jade Cabading. The man indeed recalled a girl named Jade. He had given her a ride when her car got stuck during a storm. She used his phone to call someone in Sacramento to pick her up and retrieve her Mercedes. Jade also mentioned to him that she worked at Mustang Ranch. John realized that he had finally stumbled upon a trail of the mysterious stranger. The witness not only linked Jade to the missing Mercedes, but also provided John with a clue to where she worked. Mustang Ranch was a legal brothel in the USA. It was located in Nevada and was considered a highly popular yet controversial place. With a copy of the girl's driver's license and her photo, John was able to identify her real name. The acquaintance of Philip Inhofer turned out to be a 19-year-old Michelle Comiskey. Among thieves, there is no honor. The same can be said for the girls in the brothel. They were willing to tell the police everything they knew about Michelle and recalled all the rumors that surrounded her. John had doubts about how much he could trust them. Being the most popular girl at Mustang Ranch, Michelle or Jade earned more than anyone else, which could not help but stir envy. Nevertheless, he learned a lot of new information about Michelle. She grew up in Iowa. After her parents' divorce, the girl lived with her father and brother, but couldn't get along with them, so she moved to her mother. However, she couldn't fit in with her stepfather there either, so at the age of 14, she ran away from home and headed to Florida. While other girls her age were studying in school and living under the loving care of their parents, Michelle had to survive on the streets. But strangely, she quickly felt at home there. By the time she became almost an adult, her sexual allure and ability to use that power were phenomenal. She was a tall, athletic girl who was not only beautiful, but also friendly, intelligent, adaptable to any situation. She did not conform to the stereotype of night butterflies. Her excellent manners and tasteful dressing set her apart from her peers. Even other girls couldn't resist her charm, let alone men. Since then, sex and violence followed her. At 19, she managed to marry twice. Rumors among the girls at the Mustang Ranch were that she threw a radio into her first husband's bath to electrocute him, although the police found no evidence of this. Her second marriage was even more interesting but shorter. She married a young soldier in Hawaii. Out of the blue, the young man fell ill severely, catching the attention of his commander, who demanded an investigation into the strange illness. Army investigators found a witness who saw Michelle adding rat poison to the food she prepared for her husband, but they couldn't interrogate the likely Black Widow. Michelle fled. The Army concluded that the young wife, seeking her husband's insurance payout, wanted to receive $30,000 from her husband's insurance. What's most surprising is that despite all that happened, her husband continued to claim that Michelle loved him and would never do such a thing to him. Anyway, it was precisely because of her work at the Mustang Ranch that Michelle met Philip Inhofer. She confessed to her friends that she liked Philip and that he could be her ticket to a normal life. She spent all her free time with him. They saw each other for about 4 months, and in turn, the man increasingly fell under Michelle's charm. He bought her jewelry, clothes, and showered her with attention. For Michelle's sake, he even got rid of his beloved dog. At some point, he asked his son how much his Mercedes-Benz was worth. Henry didn't understand why his father decided to buy another car, simply because Michelle liked the Mercedes. He wanted to know how valuable the car was that she was so fixated on. So Michelle's past hinted at no prior crimes, but her former roommate became the key to the investigation. She revealed that on March 5th, the day of Philip's murder, she dropped Michelle off at the man's house in Sacramento. Additionally, the girl recalled how Michelle asked her to stop at a store, where she inquired with the clerk about the effects of rat poison on a person. As a result, establishing that Michelle was the last person to see Philip alive, John obtained a warrant for her arrest on March 25th. She lived 15 miles away from Sacramento, but when the police arrived, it turned out she had fled long ago. They and her friend vanished in the middle of the night, not even paying rent. John Cabrera knew that finding Michelle would not be easy, especially since she had a head start of a whole month. The detective contacted the FBI to put her on the National Wanted list. At the same time, he obtained the address of the warehouse rented by Michelle. The detective hoped to find crucial evidence there, maybe even the murder weapon. Unfortunately, nothing significant was found, only numerous boxes that allowed the police to learn more about the fugitive's hobbies. She created amazing things from stained glass and was a fan of Batman comic books. The girl had amassed a whole collection of photos and posters about bats in general and Batman in particular. Meanwhile, news of the 19-year-old beauty, wanted in connection with such a brutal murder, naturally caught the public's attention. But John understood that if he didn't come up with something, interest in her would soon fade. Years of work had taught the detective to interact effectively with the media. During an interview with a journalist, he realized how to keep the story afloat. She asked him to tell her about the suspect, and he confessed that he called her Batgirl. The journalist's eyes lit up. John realized that this was exactly what he needed. He explained to her that Michelle was a Batman enthusiast. So much so that she had tattoos of bats encircling her left arm and tattoos of bleeding bite marks on her neck. The journalist published an article about the fugitive known as Batgirl, and it spread like wildfire. Despite this, catching Michelle was not easy. Aware that the police were searching for a beautiful young woman, she always tried to stay in the company of others. At one point, she went to Los Angeles, where she was fortunate to join the team of a very famous boxer. In Vegas, there was a fight between Tyson and Ruddock, and being resourceful and sociable, Michelle easily mingled with the boxer's staff and even attended a party with them in Nevada. Then she headed to Phoenix, Arizona, where she danced in a strip club. In Phoenix, knowing that people were aware of the tattoo on her arm, she concealed it under another tattoo. She left the one on her neck because it was hidden under her hair. But every time another story about her appeared in the newspapers or on TV, she moved on, realizing she needed to keep moving. John's instincts hinted to him that she was heading to Florida, which he informed his colleagues about. She had always told her friends at Mustang Ranch that someday she would go to Miami. Apparently, she planned to reach Miami and then travel to some country in the Caribbean, perhaps the Bahamas, convinced she would never be found there. She was probably right, so finding her should be a top priority. More than a month passed, and despite the unwavering interest from the media and the public, John and his team were one step behind Batgirl until luck finally favored the police. On May 7th, Michelle and her friend, whom she met in Phoenix, pulled over in a rented van at a parking lot in Mississippi to have a snack, unaware that the van's door was slightly ajar, revealing the Mercedes parked inside that gleamed in the light. However, a police officer sitting across the road noticed it. He approached intending to warn the driver, but was drawn to the silver-colored Mercedes-Benz parked inside the van without license plates. Michelle explained she was just transporting the car. She probably didn't know that every car has a VIN number. The officer checked the car's VIN number and, of course, discovered it was the vehicle involved in the brutal murder in Sacramento and was being sought. Both women were arrested. Michelle's new friend didn't even know her as Michelle. She knew her as Julie Nelson. She was quickly released. As for Michelle, John Cabrera had found the suspect and the car directly linking her to the death of Philip Inhofer. But without the murder weapon and forensic evidence, proving her involvement in the murder in court would be difficult. What was needed was a confession. Therefore, he flew to Mississippi as quickly as possible. He introduced himself to the girl, read her rights, and provided her with the opportunity to demand a lawyer, but she decided to answer his questions. Michelle said, "I caused pain to the man I loved," and then began her story. On that day, March 5th, her friend dropped her off at Philip's place. She arrived with her things because she had decided to quit her job at the Mustang Ranch and move in with him. After a day of shopping, they came home and had a wonderful evening. Later, when Philip went to take a shower, she slipped into the bedroom to take banned substances. She had been addicted to them for a while, but this time, they unexpectedly affected her. She returned to the bathroom, but instead of Philip, there was a monster. A terrifying monster with snakes coming out of its neck. Suddenly, she heard a voice. Evil forces urged her to deal with the monster. Listening to the command, Michelle started attacking it with a knife. After breaking one knife, she took another and continued. Then she beat it with a baseball bat. But that didn't seem enough, so she tied a bag over its head to make sure it couldn't breathe. Then she moved Philip to the storeroom, tidied up, had dinner, loaded her things into the car, and left. She claimed that she was also compelled to take Philip's car by evil forces because of its distinctive license plate. So, as a defensive tactic, Michelle opted for temporary insanity. However, several aspects did not fit into this picture. Firstly, she didn't just flee from Philip's house and hide in his car. She had the presence of mind to clean up the crime scene and take away all the dirty towels, one of the knives, and the bat. Secondly, on her way to Philip's place, she inquired about the effects of rat poison. This means that she contemplated the crime for some time, and the attack wasn't spontaneous. Thirdly, she openly told everyone that she would take her Mercedes. It was precisely the Mercedes that led to Philip's demise. When he refused to gift her the car, she simply killed the man because she desired the vehicle so much. Michelle Kaminsky was charged with first-degree murder, but John's work was not yet finished. He had to gather as much evidence as possible for the trial. Upon inspecting Phillips' found Mercedes, he discovered bloodstains inside and an aluminum bat. The stains were from the towels that the girl had disposed of while she decided to leave the bat. He also found something like a ledger containing data on hundreds of the girl's clients, including Phillips' name. The evidence was piling up like a snowball, and it seemed that Batgirl's days were numbered. She faced the highest penalty. The judge reviewed all the evidence collected by John and his team and ruled that it was more than sufficient for a jury trial. Apparently, Michelle arrived at the same conclusion. Realizing that incontrovertible evidence had been gathered against her, she struck a deal. She received a sentence ranging from 26 years to life imprisonment and never appeared before a jury. Journalists repeatedly asked her for an interview, and she declined each time. However, on the third occasion, she responded in writing, admitting that she lives every day with the murder of Mr. Inhofer. Days pass, and she feels an increasing understanding and respect for his life, making her sorrow deepen. "I took this man away from his family, friends, and everyday life. He deserved to live. Every time the Parole Commission's review date approaches, I bring pain again and again, making them relive this horror. I am no longer the young girl I used to be. Today, I hold myself fully accountable for my actions." It seemed like she was preparing for her Parole Commission hearing. It worked. After almost 30 years of imprisonment, Michelle Kaminsky emerged as a relatively young woman. She had just turned 50 and could enjoy the remaining years of her life. What she's doing now, and whether she can adapt to life at 50, remains unknown. Since youth, she was accustomed to using her beauty, attracting men like a magnet, making each feel special. But at 20, finding herself in prison, she had to learn to approach life differently. Has this path been successful? One can only hope so. On a beautiful autumn morning on October 22, 1993, Doug Boggs entered his hardware store in the resort town of Steamboat Springs, Colorado. The store had been in operation for 63 years, a family business that Doug ran with his brother, Gerald or Jerry Boggs. However, that morning, Jerry did not show up for work. This was entirely uncharacteristic of him. Jerry was a creature of habit and adhered to a strict daily routine. Doug became so worried that he went to his brother's home. The front door was locked, so Doug went around to the back door leading into the kitchen. As soon as he opened the door, he saw his brother. Jerry was lying on the floor with blood pooled around his head. It was a horrifying scene that shocked Doug to the core. He immediately called emergency services. The police officers who arrived at the scene based on the man's wounds speculated that he had been beaten with a heavy object and had also sustained 3 gunshot wounds. Now, the investigators had to determine how such a tragedy could happen to one of the most respected and beloved citizens of Steamboat Springs. 52-year-old Jerry Boggs had lived in Steamboat Springs for most of his life. He had only left the town for his studies at the University of Colorado and during his time in the Vietnam War. After returning from Vietnam, he resumed working in the family business, and now he and his brother managed the store together. Jerry handled the paperwork and supply orders while Doug interacted with the customers. Jerry was a fairly strong-willed person, but he was also kind, modest, and a loyal friend. By the age of 52, he had grown accustomed to his established bachelor lifestyle. However, everything changed one fine day when a charming 48-year-old woman walked into his store. She introduced herself as Jill Coit. Jill stood out from the other women in town, even from the tourists. She dressed stylishly and somewhat provocatively, but never vulgarly. She was sociable, cheerful, and spoke with a delightful Southern accent. Jill mentioned that she had moved from Culver, Indiana, having bought a small hotel in Steamboat Springs. Since she was fixing up the hotel with her sons, she often appeared in Jerry's store for supplies. Soon, Jerry gathered the courage to make the first move. He asked her out on a date. From that moment on, their romantic relationship began. Just 7 months after meeting, Jerry and Jill got married. This was an unusually spontaneous decision for Jerry, but he had a reason. His beloved was expecting a baby. Jerry had a successful business, family, friends, money, and now his beloved wife was going to give him a child. Jerry was over the moon with happiness. He took the news with full responsibility. He remodeled the house for the baby, bought children's furniture, and read books on parenting. However, his happiness came to an abrupt end as secrets about his wife began to surface one after another. Months went by, yet there were no physical changes in Jill's appearance. By this time, her pregnancy should have been quite visible. Suddenly, Jill went to Texas, and when she returned, she claimed to have given birth to a baby girl named Laura. By then, Jerry's family and friends were not merely suspicious. They outright declared that it was some kind of scam and that he should stay away from her and get a divorce, especially since she forgot to inform him that she was already married at the time they got married. Jerry was devastated, confused as to why she would do this to him, but he knew for certain that the marriage needed to be annulled, as his nature abhorred living in an illegal union. There was also an intriguing financial situation. Jill had convinced Jerry to sign a document stating that he had supposedly lent her $100,000. In reality, he had not given her the money. She needed it to appear as though she owed him a large sum, so she wouldn't have to repay debts to creditors or share finances with her ex-husband. However, after their marriage was annulled and she moved out of his house, Jill sued him. She wanted to remove his name from the document and sell the hotel, which was worth $600,000. As Doug recounted, his brother was already angry about Jill's lies regarding her previous marriage and the fake pregnancy, and the lawsuit brought his indignation and resentment to a new level. Jerry filed a countersuit. He wanted her to stop tarnishing his name, admit there was no pregnancy, and compensate him for his losses. For 2 years, Jerry awaited the court date while he returned to his usual routine. But 6 days before the scheduled court date, his brother found him dead on the kitchen floor. The police carefully examined the crime scene, only to be met with enormous disappointment. There were no signs of forced entry, nothing had been stolen, and the killer had left no clues behind. The murderer took the firearm with them and left no fingerprints or blood on the shovel used to beat the victim. Whoever committed this heinous crime had covered their tracks exceptionally well. Neighbors did not hear any gunshots. However, one neighbor did recall something suspicious. On the day of the murder, she was outside and saw 2 people walking down the street. They looked suspicious enough that she went back inside. Despite the warm weather, they were dressed very warmly and resembled hunters. One was clearly a man, but she wasn't sure about the second person. There was definitely something off about them. At the same time, the medical examiner conducted an autopsy. He determined that the attack on Jerry Boggs had occurred in the afternoon of October 21st. He confirmed that Jerry had been shot 3 times, beaten, and an attempt had been made to strangle him. However, he was puzzled by marks on the right side of Jerry's neck and cheek. These were not the characteristic muzzle imprints of a point-blank gunshot wound. The medical examiner was unable to determine what had caused these mysterious marks. However, for Jerry's family, his murder was no mystery. Doug Boggs told the police that he knew exactly who was responsible. He pleaded with the police to question Jerry's ex-wife, Jill Coit. Doug's suspicions had been aroused 2 years earlier when Jill claimed she was pregnant. His brother was in love and believed everything Jill said. Concerned, Jerry's relatives contacted a friend who was a private detective and asked her to investigate Jill's background. What the detective uncovered was a completely different Jill than the one Jerry knew. With each new detail, the detective was more and more astounded. She even had difficulty determining Jill's birth year because Jill Coit had 4 birth certificates, 3 social security numbers, and at least 15 different identities she had used over the past 25, 30 years. By the time Jill met Jerry, he was potentially husband number 8. Jill Lanita Billiot was born in Louisiana. She had a tumultuous relationship with her brother, which led her to leave home at 15 and move in with her grandparents in Indiana. Local boys were captivated by her southern accent. One such admirer was 18-year-old Larry Eugene Einen. Evidently, the attraction was mutual because at 17, Jill dropped out of school and married him. The marriage dissolved quickly, within a couple of months. And when Jill left her young husband, she took the only thing he had, $280 earned from his masonry assistant job. Interestingly, divorce at that time required stating a reason. Larry cited cruel and inhumane treatment, while Jill requested a restraining order against him. What exactly transpired between the young couple remains unknown, but Jill was determined not to work a modest factory job. She decided to complete her education and returned to Louisiana to attend acting classes at the university. For 3 years, she managed to focus on her studies, at least not marrying anyone. However, she eventually married another student, Stephen Moore. Unfortunately, even the birth of their son, Seth, could not save their marriage. Jill left Stephen and moved to Texas with their son. Despite how her approach to life and marriage would change in the future, she didn't gain much financially from her first two marriages. While fully aware of her value and attractiveness, Jill secured a job as a model. A beautiful girl caught the eye of successful engineer William Clark Coit Jr. He was unfazed by her two previous marriages and adopted Seth as his own son. Jill claimed that he was the love of her life. Despite her happy marriage to William, Jill didn't divorce her second husband until after the birth of her and William's first child. Their second son was born later. William had more resources than any of her previous husbands, which likely sparked Jill's attraction to substantial wealth, and she eagerly spent it. However, William was often away from home, leading Jill to start having affairs. Upon discovering this, William demanded a divorce. A bitter custody battle ensued. But 3 weeks before the divorce was finalized, tragedy struck. William Coit Jr. was murdered in his own home, shot 3 times in the back with a .22 caliber weapon. Detectives believed he knew his killer since he was shot from behind. Before his death, William had withdrawn a substantial amount of money from his accounts, telling friends he did so to prevent Jill from getting it. Unfortunately, he miscalculated. The money was never found, likely because Jill was the one who discovered William's body when he failed to show up for work. Naturally, the police suspected his 27-year-old widow, Jill. However, she managed to flee to New Orleans and hired a lawyer. On his advice, she admitted herself to a psychiatric hospital. This tactic worked, and the police were unable to question her. Without sufficient evidence to extradite her forcibly, Jill spent a year in the psychiatric facility. After her release, she reclaimed her 3 sons from relatives, secured the money she inherited from William, and moved to California to start anew. In California, Jill tried something new. She met Bruce Johansson, who was over 90 years old. Unable to marry him, she used her charm to persuade him to adopt her. After the man passed away, likely from natural causes, she inherited all his assets, finances, and property. She had no time to mourn because she was preparing for marriage number 4 with Major Donald Brody of the Marine Corps. However, Jill unexpectedly found out that her husband could refuse her access to his funds. Their relationship quickly deteriorated, so she resorted to another way to extract money from him. After a lengthy separation, she delighted him with news of giving birth to a boy named Thaddeus John Brody. The Major didn't believe her. She then showed him a fake birth certificate and asked acquaintances to lend her their child temporarily to show him a son, allegedly theirs. But unable to sustain this, a month later she delivered the Major horrifying news. The child had died and she buried him in the family crypt. Fortunately, it was a lie, and when the crypt was later opened, there was no child inside. Realizing she could no longer gain anything from the Major, Jill divorced him and married a man named Louis A. DeRosa. He was a lawyer she hired after fleeing following the death of her third husband, William. He also assisted her in Bruce Johansson's adoption. Their relationship was tumultuous, with the couple divorcing and reconciling 2-3 times over many years. During one of their separations, Jill managed to marry husband number 6, Eldon Dwayne Metzger, an auction organizer. This marriage was very short and illegal because she divorced Louis DeRosa in Haiti, a divorce not recognized in the USA. Thus, she was still legally married to Louis when she moved to Indiana and met her 7th husband. 2 of her sons attended school in Indiana, where one of the boys' school director was Carl V. Steele. Jill lived with him for 7 years, which were some of the longest and most normal relationships in her life. Carl treated her and the boys well. He loved skiing and often took the family to Steamboat Springs, Colorado. They enjoyed their time there and dreamed of growing old together in that place. During one of their trips, the couple decided to invest in a business by purchasing a small hotel. Jill convinced Carl that she would handle everything herself because he was a teacher, and she felt more capable of managing finances. The plan was for Jill to move to Steamboat Springs, buy the hotel in both their names, renovate it with their sons, and start managing it. Carl would join her when school holidays began. However, Carl encountered a very unpleasant surprise when he arrived in town. Jill simply ousted him. She persuaded him to say goodbye to his money, convinced him to invest in her business, and he was no longer needed. She registered the hotel under her and her elder son Seth's name only. Carl was left without money and in debt. After less than 10 years together, Jill and Carl parted ways. They didn't finalize their divorce before Jill set her sights on husband number 8, Jerry Boggs, the owner of a store in Steamboat Springs. Investigators found too many coincidences between the two murder cases of Jill's ex-husbands, William and Jerry. Both men were killed with the same caliber weapon, which was never recovered. In both cases, there was no forced entry into the home. Jill knew the layout of the rooms in the house, knew when Jerry would return home from work, and it would not have been difficult for her to catch William at home in the evening while he watched TV. But the similarities didn't end there. Jill had a financial motive in both crimes. However, when investigators talked to Jill, it turned out she had alibis. In the same month she annulled her marriage to Jerry, she finally divorced Carl Steele, so she was not married to anyone at the time, perhaps a new feeling for her. Instead, she was dating a telephone technician named Michael Backus. During her conversation with investigators, Jill stated that she and Michael were camping in Poudre Canyon, 240 kilometers away from the crime scene. To set up a tent in that location, they had to fill out a form and pay a fee. This meant that Jill could prove she was in Poudre Canyon if needed. Therefore, she was too far away by the evening of October 21st to have killed Jerry. Investigators decided they needed to pinpoint the exact time frame when the attack on Jerry occurred. A crucial piece of evidence was studying the contents of his stomach. Jerry Boggs was a creature of habit. He opened his store at the same time every day. Then at 11 a.m., he went to a restaurant for breakfast where he always ate the same meal: hash browns, eggs, and toast. Specialists used plant cells, which, unlike protein-based foods, pass through the digestive system unchanged. They determined that Jerry had consumed onions. However, the restaurant chef did not add onions to the hash browns, eggs, or toast. This indicated that Jerry had indeed eaten his meal, meaning he was killed closer to the evening of October 21st, when Jill had an alibi. Thus, Jill had a motive, but no opportunity to kill him. If Jill didn't kill him, who did? Perhaps the unidentified hunters who had frightened Jerry's neighbor. However, the police had no leads on how to find them. Then, on a hunch, one of the investigators visited the restaurant where Jerry had breakfast and stood in the kitchen, observing the chef at work. He noticed that although the chef didn't add onions to the hash browns, he used the same spatula to mix them as he did with onions. This contamination could explain why onion particles were found in Jerry's system. It indicated that he was killed 3 hours after breakfast, a time frame during which Jill didn't have an alibi. Furthermore, the police couldn't find the form she supposedly filled out for the Poudre Canyon visit. This meant she hadn't been camping with her boyfriend and they had both lied. Interestingly, while the police awaited the results from Jerry's stomach contents, Jill managed to get married again, possibly for the last time. When unpleasant rumors began circulating about her in Steamboat Springs, she left for Las Vegas, where she seduced Roy Carroll, a retired Navy officer. However, before the end of the year, she left him and reunited with Michael Backus. According to some sources, she married him. Although no marriage certificate was found, she used his surname in any case. Meanwhile, gathering only circumstantial evidence, the police managed to obtain a search warrant for the suspect's car. Inside, they found maps of Mexico, a couple of wigs, and a stun gun. The discovery of the stun gun prompted the police to exhume Jerry's body to conduct several tests. It turned out that the marks on the victim's face matched those from this weapon. Additionally, the wigs found in Jill's car matched the description of the appearance of the two hunters observed by Jerry's neighbor on the day of his murder. However, the police were unable to arrest the accomplices because they had disappeared. The case would have stalled if not for unexpected assistance from a surprising source: Jill's eldest son, Seth. He called the police and revealed that his mother had asked him to help cover up Jerry's murder and dispose of the body. However, Seth liked Jerry and refused to assist. He informed the police that when the net started closing in on their associates, Jill and Michael traveled to California, crossed by boat from San Diego to Tijuana, then to Mexico City, and finally to Spain. Without Seth's cooperation, Jill might never have been apprehended. However, just a week later, she decided to return to the United States, where police officers tracked her down. Some speculate that she ran out of money. In any case, returning was an incredible risk, bringing her not only back to the country, but also to Steamboat Springs, where she drove around town in her own car, seemingly unfazed by the danger. On December 23, 1993, Jill and Michael were arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Even during questioning, Jill behaved provocatively, attempting to flirt with detectives and vehemently asserting her innocence. She was nearly 50 years old, but had never faced serious legal consequences despite her numerous marriages without proper divorces, document forgery, identity theft, insurance fraud, and being a potential suspect in her third husband's murder. She firmly believed that money ruled the world and that she was untouchable. The trial began in 1995. One by one, witnesses took the stand, including Michael Backus's colleague, who testified that Jill and Michael had tried to persuade them to kill Jerry Boggs, citing false claims that he had harmed a young girl and deserved to die. However, Jerry was a respected member of society, and these claims did not hold up under scrutiny. Furthermore, after her breakup with Jerry, Jill posed as a psychologist, ostensibly helping flood victims. During one session, she asked a client for a gun and offered $1,000 to kill Jerry Boggs. Naturally, the client declined this shocking proposal, especially given the context of seeking professional help for trauma. This incident underscored Jill's audacious approach to manipulating others for her own ends. When their associates failed to find someone willing to commit the murder, Jill and Michael decided to take matters into their own hands. Michael and Jill fabricated a camping trip in the canyon. However, they used this as an opportunity to practice disguising themselves. On the appointed day, they walked the streets disguised as a pair of hunters. Jill wore a mustache, wig, beard, and men's clothing. Investigators believe their accomplices entered through the back door and waited for the victim, lying in wait. After Jerry finished work early and returned home around noon, the killers immobilized him using an electroshock gun. They then beat him with a shovel and attempted to strangle him. When that failed, according to detectives, Jill shot her ex-husband 3 times. Later, she called her son Seth and said, "It's over. It's very messy." As Seth testified in court, he knew she was referring to Jerry's murder. Indeed, his testimony proved crucial in convincing the jurors of the guilt of the accomplices. It took them 5 hours to convict both of first-degree murder and conspiracy. Each received a life sentence plus an additional 48 years for conspiracy, along with a $1 million fine. Clearly, the fine was intended to prevent them from profiting from any movie or book deals about their story. But even this didn't stop Jill. She advertised herself as a green card for anyone willing to marry her. When this project failed, in 2002 she claimed she was subjected to violence and abuse in prison, and her rights were violated. She alleged that a guard had assaulted her and broken her finger. Additionally, she claimed she was denied special orthopedic devices for arthritis. She attempted similar claims in 2006, but they were not believed. Despite filing appeals, all were rejected. Some might say living in marriage is like being in prison anyway. But for Jill Coit, this prison became a lifelong reality. Jill was furious with Jerry because he dared to stand in her way and thwarted her plans. Not only did he refuse to let her sell the hotel, but a private detective hired by his family had gathered enough evidence to expose her. Jerry intended to bring her to justice in court, revealing who she truly was and what she had done, so she couldn't deceive anyone else. However, like William, Jerry never got the chance to confront Jill face-to-face in court. Both men were killed just days before the trial was set to begin. The murder of Jill's third husband was never solved. Jerry died trying to stop a predator, paying a high price for the truth. While Jill had no trouble cycling through men in her life, she didn't easily let go of their money. For the money she believed rightfully hers, she fought to the death, literally in their deaths.
Saturday, June 25th, 1983 began like any other day, but everything was about to change for 37-year-old John Gentry. His girlfriend had told him she was expecting a child and that he would soon become a father. Together with a small group of friends, they spent some time at a restaurant celebrating several happy occasions at once. The evening went perfectly. Around 10 to 10:30 p.m., John decided it was time to call it a night. He planned to head home, pick up a bottle of champagne on the way, and wait for his girlfriend there so they could continue celebrating the wonderful news. John walked to his Ford Futura parked near the restaurant. He got inside, put the key into the ignition, and turned it. The engine obediently purred to life. Then he switched on the rear lights. All the same familiar actions, except this time, hell itself broke loose. Because by doing so, he triggered the detonation of dynamite that had been waiting in the trunk of his car. The explosion sent shards of metal flying forward, tearing into the man's neck and back, hurling him out of the vehicle. Lying on the pavement, bleeding, surrounded by smoke and shattered glass. He thought the battery had exploded. At least to his disoriented mind, that seemed the only possible explanation. The next thing he remembered was medics cutting off his clothes and rushing to treat him. Then he was lifted into an ambulance and taken to the hospital. For 4 days, John would hover between life and death. But he would pull through and go on to play a key role in this story. A story that, in fact, is not really about him at all. It is about a woman who, from her earliest childhood, had known the vilest side of this world and decided to take from it everything she believed was hers, even at the cost of her own flesh and blood. Rescue services rushed to the scene near the Driftwood restaurant in Pensacola, Florida. Paramedics immediately began treating the victim, while officers focused on finding out what had caused the explosion. They questioned witnesses who had been present at the scene. The witnesses explained that the victim's name was John Gentry, 37 years old. He had been at the restaurant with his girlfriend, Judy Bonanno. Judy owned a nail salon. One of her employees had just turned 21, and Judy wanted everyone to celebrate the occasion. It had been a wonderful dinner. People laughed, enjoyed themselves, and made plans to go to a club afterward. John, however, didn't want to go to the club. Instead, he decided to head home and wait for his girlfriend there. But just as he walked outside, a deafening explosion rang out. The entire restaurant shook. Everyone rushed out into the street. John was lying on the pavement, surrounded by shards of glass, smoke, and debris. The roof of his car had been blown off, the seats ripped to shreds. It was nothing short of a miracle that John had survived such a blast. Still, he was gravely injured, his body riddled with fragments of metal. Judy dropped to her knees beside him. She screamed and wept, begging him to hold on and not lose consciousness. When the paramedics arrived, she accompanied her lover to the hospital. After examining the car, to everyone's horror, it became clear that the explosion had not been an accident. Dynamite had been placed inside the vehicle, wired to the rear lights. 2 sticks of dynamite were found in the trunk behind the back seat. The moment John switched on the lights, the car blew apart. Unfortunately, John's vehicle had been parked quite a distance from the restaurant entrance, and the police were unable to find any eyewitnesses. Detectives hurried to the hospital, where doctors reported that the man had miraculously survived surgery, but remained in critical condition. He was in a coma. Investigators then spoke with his loved ones, who had rushed to the hospital, fearing this might be their last chance to say goodbye to someone dear. They described John as a very pleasant, polite, and well-educated man. Being attractive and sociable, he was well-liked by women. He had met his girlfriend 3 years earlier. The romance developed quickly, and John was completely smitten with Judy. Within 6 months, they began living together. John, Judy, and her teenage children, James and Kimberly. Over the years, their relationship had only grown stronger, and their businesses more successful. Judy owned a beauty salon, while John sold carpets and wallpaper. Their ventures brought in a very good income, and John and Judy enjoyed spending their money, lacking for nothing. But as with many businessmen, John occasionally had disagreements with his partners. Judy explained that at one point John decided to expand and struck a deal with a woman in Mobile, Alabama, to open another store. However, the deal fell through, and the would-be partner became furious. She filed a lawsuit against John and lost just 3 weeks before the incident at the restaurant. Could it have been possible that she had hired someone to kill John out of revenge? Detectives were uncertain. A professional hitman would have made sure the victim was killed, placing dynamite under the seat rather than in the trunk. Whoever planted the explosives was clearly not a professional. Even so, detectives spoke with the suspect named by Judy, but they found no connection to the crime. 4 days after the explosion, investigators finally received the news they had been waiting for. John had come out of his coma. He was wrapped in bandages, looking and feeling terrible, but he was alive and able to answer police questions. John had no idea who might have wanted him dead. He was certain it wasn't the woman from Alabama because their disagreement wasn't worth killing over. Hoping for some kind of lead, detectives asked if he remembered any unusual problems in recent months. The man replied that about 6 months earlier, a mysterious illness had forced him to spend nearly a week in the hospital. Though doctors were never able to determine what was wrong, he had suffered from severe stomach pain and nausea. Eventually, he felt better and was discharged. His girlfriend had once worked as a nurse, and she took excellent care of him. He returned home, resumed his normal life, continued taking vitamins, and soon after, he ended up back in the hospital with the same unexplained stomach pains. John blamed the vitamins, thinking he might have developed an intolerance. The police asked how he had started taking them in the first place. He explained that he had caught a cold, and his girlfriend had given him capsules to help him recover faster. Detectives requested his permission to take the capsules from his briefcase and have them tested. While waiting for the results, they decided to put the man's life under a microscope, and they would start with the person who had given him the medicine, Judy Buenoano. Everyone who knew Judy was captivated by her. Intelligent, charming, generous, sociable, no one had a bad word to say about her. And when investigators ran her name, nothing suspicious appeared. But in the records department, a clerk happened to mention that the Spanish surname Buenoano was the equivalent of the English surname Goodyear. The detective asked her to check under that name as well, and his instincts proved correct. There was information on a Judy Goodyear. That was unusual enough for detectives to wonder why Judy had changed her name to Buenoano. So they dug deeper and uncovered a series of disturbing coincidences, both fascinating and horrifying. Judy Annalou Welty, known to everyone simply as Judy, was the third of 4 children in the family. Her mother was Apache, and the girl was named in her honor. But before Judy even turned 2, her mother died of tuberculosis. Her father, a farm worker, was supposed to raise the 4 children on his own. Supposed to, but he didn't. Instead of surrounding them with love and care after their mother's death, he cowardly abandoned his responsibilities. He sent Judy and her younger brother Robert to live with their grandmother, while the 2 older children were given up for adoption. It was a very difficult start in life for little Judy and Robert. A glimmer of hope appeared about 10 years later, when their father remarried. He brought Judy and Robert back from their grandmother's home. Their stepmother already had 2 sons, and in theory, Judy and Robert could have become part of a big, happy family. In reality, Judy was turned into a servant in her own house. She had to take care of all the household chores, and if her father or stepmother didn't like something, which happened very often, she was forced to sit hungry in the corner while the rest of the family enjoyed dinner. Robert suffered as well, beaten by everyone, his father, stepmother, and even his stepbrothers. Judy endured this hell for 2 years, until at the age of 14, she snapped. In an attempt to protect Robert, she poured boiling grease on her stepbrothers. Then she began throwing anything she could find at her father and stepmother. Instead of helping the girl, instead of involving social services, they sent Judy to jail for 2 months. At just 14, she found herself behind bars among real criminals. When her sentence was over, she refused to return home. Instead, she was placed in a juvenile facility that also had a school. She graduated at 16, but wanted nothing more to do with her family, not even with Robert, whom she blamed for her breakdown. Judy felt that the world owed her for all the years of humiliation and suffering. From that point on, she decided she would manipulate the system at every possible opportunity. Judy trained as a nurse and began working in the profession. Still a teenager herself, she gave birth to a boy she named Michael. She was not married to the child's father, something frowned upon at the time. A few years later, she met a young Air Force Sergeant, James Goodyear. The 2 fell in love, got married, and James adopted Michael as his own. In their marriage, 2 more children were born, James Jr. and Kimberly. In 1970, James was deployed to Vietnam, where the war was raging. He returned home a year later. But though James had survived the war, he did not live long after returning to his beloved wife. He began suffering from seizures, stomach pain, nausea, and hallucinations. He was admitted to the hospital, where he died on September 15, 1971. Doctors told his wife that his death was the result of lung, heart, and kidney failure. A 37-year-old man suddenly dying from the simultaneous failure of 3 major organs should have raised questions. But no one looked deeper. The grieving widow didn't even wait for her husband's body to grow cold before hurrying to the bank to collect the payouts from the 3 life insurance policies taken out on James. While her husband was away at war, Judy didn't even try to remain faithful. She was seeing a man named Robert Crawford. Their affair ended when her husband returned home, but it resumed shortly after his premature death. It was Robert who introduced Judy to Bobby Joe Morris, and very quickly, his lover moved in with Bobby Joe, while Robert disappeared from her life. At the time, he didn't know it, but he was incredibly lucky their paths parted. Judy soon changed both her own last name and that of her children to Morris, even though she and Bobby Joe were never legally married. When Judy and Bobby Joe moved to Trinidad, Colorado, where they bought a house together, her previous home in Orlando mysteriously burned down. The property had been insured, and Judy collected a handsome payout. Judy and Bobby Joe lived in Colorado for only 16 months before his health began to deteriorate. Judy claimed that the 39-year-old man enjoyed drinking, so doctors treated him for pancreatitis. He did improve somewhat in the hospital and was discharged, into the care of his nurse girlfriend. At home, however, he grew ill again. He collapsed at the dinner table, unconscious. Bobby Joe was rushed back to the hospital where he died 5 days later. Doctors suspected nothing and ruled that he had died of natural causes. Judy wanted her boyfriend cremated quickly, but his mother intervened and insisted on a proper funeral. Sadly, she did not insist on an autopsy or a thorough toxicology test. Had she done so, the coroner would have discovered enough arsenic in the man's system to kill 10 people. Judy did not attend her lover's funeral. She was far too busy collecting the payouts from the 3 life insurance policies she had taken out on Bobby Joe, as well as another insurance payout for their Colorado home, which quite conveniently had also burned down. After Bobby Joe's death, his surname no longer meant anything to her, and she changed it to Buono. In June 1978, she moved to Pensacola and bought a new house for herself and her children. One couldn't help but wonder, in her plans, how long was this new home supposed to last before it too would accidentally go up in flames? The police continued digging into her past and made an even more shocking discovery, this time about her son Michael. Judy had long stopped mentioning him, but she had another child, Michael, who had been adopted by James Goodyear. In 1979, 8 years after his stepfather James had died, Michael also joined the Army. The teenager joined only because he wanted his mother to be proud of him. He had always felt like a burden to her and longed only for simple maternal love, nothing more. However, his mother hated her firstborn, most likely because he was born out of wedlock. Of course, it wasn't his fault, and if Judy had anyone to blame, it certainly wasn't Michael. Michael completed his Army training and was set to begin service as a water purification specialist. But before that, he went home for 2 weeks to celebrate Thanksgiving with his family. At home, he suddenly fell ill. Although, was it really that sudden? He had trouble walking, his arm and leg muscles ached, he was nauseous, experienced abdominal pain, and white lines appeared on his nails. When he returned to the Army still suffering from these symptoms, doctors quickly narrowed down the possible cause to one thing: arsenic poisoning. But by a curious coincidence, officers used arsenic during water purification training. So everyone assumed the poisoning had occurred in the Army. The young man did not die, but he developed paresis, a condition characterized by partial loss of muscle strength. Unlike paralysis, where a muscle completely loses its ability to move, in paresis the muscle retains some, though reduced, function. Essentially, he could now fully move only his left hand. To help the rest of his body regain at least partial function, he wore a muscle support corset and bandages weighing 23 kilograms. But it was necessary if he ever hoped to recover. Naturally, Michael had to leave the Army. He returned home to his mother, who thought it would be a good idea to go canoeing with a son who could not move on his own and was wearing extremely heavy bandages. She placed Michael in the canoe, his brother James sat beside him, and they set out to fish. After a while, rescuers pulled Judy and James from the water. Judy claimed that while she was paddling, the boat hit a rock and capsized. The canoe struck James in the neck, and the mother rushed to help him. She helped her son stay afloat, but she could not help Michael. The weight of the young man immediately dragged him under. Imagine the horror of being pulled down despite desperate but futile attempts to stay afloat. Imagine the pain as water stung his eyes, clogged his ears, and finally filled his lungs, entering through his nose and mouth. The last thing he experienced before everything went dark was the bitter taste of betrayal from the person closest to him. The mother he loved more than anyone in the world watched coldly as he drowned. Again, no one suspected anything. Despite Judy telling the officer who questioned her that their fishing gear had snagged on something and that the canoe overturned when one of them tried to free it, no one doubted her. It's astounding how calmly liars can tell 2 completely different stories in a short period of time and then act surprised when they become suspects. But it would be a long time before Judy was suspected of murdering her son. In the meantime, she hurried to collect the insurance payouts. Her son, of course, had been insured. The mother received $20,000 from the Army and 2 insurance policies worth $20,000 and $30,000. Additionally, she was to receive another $20,000 if Michael's death was deemed accidental. By a curious coincidence, Michael died as the result of an accident. The insurance companies paid her without question. Today, that payout would roughly equal $750,000. With this money, the loving mother opened a beauty salon. Business went well and was profitable, but Judy could not stop. She had already set her sights on a new victim, a successful businessman named John Gentry. Police in Pensacola reached these conclusions after examining Judy's life. Their suspicions were confirmed by a toxicology report. In the vitamins John had been taking, only the capsule's shells remained. Inside, investigators found arsenic and paraformaldehyde, a carcinogen capable of causing severe harm to the human body. This substance is also a disinfectant commonly used in beauty salons. The most striking part, however, is that this chemical wouldn't have been detected in a hospital or even a coroner's office because it is not listed among standard poisons. Detectives discovered that John had also been insured. He and Judy had taken out insurance policies on each other for $50,000, since they were both business owners, and if anything happened to one of them, the other could cover the first debts. But later they supposedly canceled the policies, or so John thought. In reality, Judy continued paying for his insurance, and John was insured not for $50,000, but for $500,000. Additionally, Judy was named in his will and would inherit half of his estate, totaling $750,000. Judy clearly believed she would get away with it, as always. Even before receiving the money, she had already booked a cruise for herself and her children, but of course, not for John. And the cruelest twist of all for the naive, trusting man was that Judy did not intend to have a child with him. Several years earlier, she had undergone surgery that made it impossible for her to ever become a mother. When detectives asked John if he remembered any other details about the day of the explosion, he recalled something he had never considered important, until now. He had bought car speakers and asked James, Judy's son, to install them in his car. James had promised to do it, but later John noticed the speakers hadn't been installed and assumed the boy simply hadn't had the time. Now, however, both he and the detectives saw it differently. Previously, detectives weren't certain that Judy had planted the dynamite herself, but now they were convinced it was her 18-year-old son. That evening, Judy had asked her boyfriend to park the car away from the restaurant entrance. John had found this odd, but complied. In reality, this allowed Judy's son to place the explosive device in John's car without fear of being seen. James took the dynamite, the car keys, installed the device, closed the trunk, and quickly disappeared. During a search of James's room, police found a wire identical to the one used to connect the dynamite to the car. An FBI lab report soon confirmed a complete and indisputable match. The dynamite itself was traced back to a close friend of James in Alabama. It wouldn't have taken James long to learn from him how to connect the wires. Given everything the investigators had already uncovered, they arrested Judy and her 18-year-old son James and charged both with attempted murder of John Gentry. Fortunately, John survived. However, detectives believed that other victims of the Black Widow had been far less lucky. Now they needed to find evidence linking Judy to the deaths of other men in her life. This required exhumation, a complex and difficult process. Permission for exhumation is granted only in extreme cases, when no other means of obtaining evidence is possible. Fortunately for the investigators, the court agreed and issued an exhumation order. On March 14, 1984, 13 years after his death, the remains of James Goodyear, Judy's late husband, were exhumed. When the toxicology results arrived from the laboratory, the investigators held their breath. James's body contained enough arsenic to poison 13 people. They also exhumed the body of Michael, Judy's son, who had drowned during a fishing trip. Arsenic was also detected in his body. Judy was tried for her crimes in separate trials. First, she was found guilty of the first-degree murder of her son Michael and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. 7 months later, she was convicted of the attempted murder of John Gentry and received an additional 12 years in prison. James, however, was acquitted by the jury, likely out of sympathy, since he had been willing to do whatever his mother instructed. The final trial concerned the murder of James Goodyear. The stakes were incredibly high. If found guilty, the 41-year-old Judy faced the death penalty. She took the witness stand and tried to defend herself, but the jury did not believe her.
You gave the jury a real good show. You don't know you weren't there.
She was convicted and sentenced to death by electric chair. On March 30th, 1998, the sentence was carried out. Judy was 54 years old at the time, and she spent her final hours with her children. Investigators also exhumed the body of Judy's boyfriend, Bobby Joe Morris. Toxicology revealed enough arsenic in his body to kill 10 people. However, since Judy had already been sentenced to death, prosecutors did not pursue another trial, sparing taxpayers the cost. James Goodyear, Bobby Joe Morris, John Gentry, Judy could have been happy with any of these men, as they genuinely loved her. and were willing to care for her and her children. But it was never enough for her. She decided she wanted John's money. Without John, had she stopped after the first, second, or even third murder, she might have gotten away with it. Fortunately, her spree came to an end. But how many others like her have escaped justice? Villars-Bonneau, France. Early in the morning of October 31, 2008, a local resident who had gone out for his usual walk with the dog noticed something unexpected in a field near the railway tracks. A burnt-out car with very little left of it. The windows were gone, the tires had melted, the plastic parts and the upholstery had been completely destroyed by fire. The man hurried to contact the police, who unfortunately discovered victims inside the vehicle. On the back seat lay a human body, or rather, what was left of it. The arms and legs were missing, and the skull was deformed. At that stage, the forensic expert could only say that it had been a man. Another body was found in the trunk. It was a dog. Sadly, it had shared the fate of the man, probably its owner. Though, of course, the officers couldn't be sure of that yet. One thing, however, was beyond doubt. Before the vehicle was set on fire, it had been doused with some flammable liquid. At first, investigators weren't sure whether it was a case of murder or if the man himself had chosen such an end, taking his pet with him into death. But what puzzled them in the suicide theory was the fact that the man had been seated in the rear passenger seat. That was an unnatural position for someone alone in their own car. Very quickly, the investigators began leaning toward the criminal hypothesis. Inside the car, they found no ignition key, no wallet, no phone, only the two bodies. But fortunately for the investigation, the fire had spared the license plate. It was lying nearby, and some of its numbers were still legible. This meant they could search the vehicle database and identify the owner. Since Villars-Bonneau is a very small French village, locating the car's owner turned out to be rather easy. It was Daniel Cano, who lived just 150 meters from where the car had been found. The investigators headed straight to his address. A beautiful woman opened the door. She introduced herself as Madame Cano, Manuela Cano. The police officers were in no hurry to shock her with the news of the terrible discovery. First, they carefully asked where her husband was. What struck them unpleasantly was that Manuela answered their questions calmly, without making the slightest attempt to ask any in return. The police were used to people immediately wanting to know what had happened and why the police had come. Manuela's relaxed demeanor almost unsettled them. In any case, after hearing that Daniel was not at home, the police asked his wife for permission to search the house. There, they discovered the man's phone, driver's license, and identity card. In the garage, they also noticed a dog basket. Manuela explained that it belonged to her daughter's dog. At this point, the officers were almost certain that the body found in the burnout car was that of Daniel Cano, which meant they now had to ask his wife when she had last seen him. Manuela said that on the morning of the previous day, October 30, her husband had been chopping wood. He developed a headache and took some medicine. Apparently, he had made a mistake. Instead of taking a painkiller, he had taken a sleeping pill. The investigators silently noted that such a mistake was not unthinkable. The Cano household was full of medications, on the kitchen shelves, in the bathroom, in the bedroom. This happens sometimes, but it is rare to find a home that resembles a small pharmacy. In any case, Manuela went on, she said that after lunch, the couple had decided to visit her parents, who lived 80 kilometers away from Villars-Bonneau. Manuela took the wheel, letting her husband nap. However, he fell asleep so deeply that when they arrived, she left him in the car and went inside to see her family alone. Around 8 or 9 in the evening, the couple returned home and got into an argument. Daniel left the house. Manuela, meanwhile, took a sleeping pill and went to bed, not caring whether he came back or not. When she woke up the next morning and did not see him, she assumed he had gone to work. That was all she could say about her husband's last day. Within a few days, the pathologist confirmed that the charred body was indeed Daniel Cano's. Daniel, 58, worked as a welder and was generally a skilled handyman. Manuela, for her part, was engaged in her passion, running her own driving school. The couple had met in 1991 when Daniel was 40 and Manuela was 30. Both had children from previous relationships. Daniel had a son, Nicholas, and Manuela a daughter, Virginie. The children were about the same age and quickly became close friends. Manuela became a second mother to Nicholas, guiding him with his studies and household responsibilities. Daniel, in turn, treated his stepdaughter with great kindness. In many ways, theirs was an exemplary family. They lived in a house that Daniel had built with his own hands. They had been together for 17 years. Even though the children were grown, they continued to see each other often, gathering for dinner at the family home. In December 2008, the toxicology report came in. According to it, at the time of his death, Daniel's body contained 3 medications, 2 different sleeping pills and 1 neuroleptic drug. This combination can cause not only drowsiness, but can also plunge a person into a state resembling a coma. In other words, when the killer set fire to the car with Daniel and the dog inside, the man was most likely unconscious. However, Daniel had been taking only 1 medication, medicine for hypertension. Nothing else had ever been prescribed to him, unlike his wife. Among the prescriptions issued to Manuela, the officers found the names of all 3 drugs that were detected in her late husband's body. This discovery prompted the police to take a much closer look at the victim's wife. They felt she was hiding something from them. Their suspicions only grew stronger when they learned that a month earlier, Daniel had already come within a hair's breadth of death and had survived by sheer luck. During their search of the Cano family home, the officers had already noticed that one of the rooms, the couple's bedroom, looked strikingly different from the others. It had clearly been damaged by fire not long ago. Indeed, on September 29, 2008, a fire had broken out in the Cano household. It was Manuela who called the firefighters, and while they extinguished the flames, she simply sat on the couch, waiting for them to finish and leave. Meanwhile, the firefighters noticed her husband Daniel lying on the sofa with severe burns. His wife explained that he had been in the bedroom when the fire started. He woke up, she led him downstairs, and despite the burns, he fell asleep again. The firefighters gave him first aid and transported him to the hospital. Manuela explained that a month earlier, Daniel's mother had died, and in her memory, he had lit a candle. But the dog had run into the bedroom, knocked over the candle, and caused the fire. The story sounded plausible, so no investigation into the fire was launched. Still, the doctors found it strange that Daniel had slept so deeply and, when finally roused, could barely string 2 words together. At the hospital, tests revealed that he had taken sleeping pills. But again, Manuela was quick to explain. Her husband had been grieving his mother's death and had recently been using her sleeping medication. This explanation was accepted, and no further questions were asked. However, sometime later, when Nicholas came for dinner with his father and the stepmother, he overheard his father say, "Listen, don't take me for a fool. I know for sure there were no candles in that room." In other words, Daniel knew the dog couldn't have knocked over a candle. So why didn't he pursue the matter or go to the police with his suspicions? It's hard to say. Perhaps he still loved his wife. Or maybe he simply didn't want to cause her any trouble, and it was easier for him to think about divorce, but he never got the chance. The circle of the investigation was tightening around Manuela, yet the police could not understand why she would want to kill her husband. They had lived together for 17 years, and everything suggested that they got along well. They seemed to be a close, solid family, but in reality, things were not as perfect as they appeared. Manuela had a dangerous addiction, not to illegal substances, but to casinos and gambling. She was a compulsive gambler, a slave to slot machines. Her gambling debts amounted to around 90,000 euros. In order to deal with her debts, and most likely to continue going to the casino, she resorted to fraud. As the director of a driving school, she set up a scheme that made it easier for candidates to obtain driver's licenses, provided they paid her 1,500 euros. To achieve this, Manuela seduced a licensing inspector. However, her secret eventually came to light, and in 2004, 4 years before Daniel's death, an investigation was launched. Manuela was fined 80,000 euros. She was forced to sell the driving school to her brother. In other words, 4 years earlier, Daniel had already seen a completely different side of his wife, and the discovery deeply shocked him. But even then, he didn't know everything. The situation reached its peak on March 28, 2008, when Daniel received a call from a bank employee informing him that he and his wife were behind on their monthly loan payment, and if the money was not received, the bank would be forced to seize the family home. That day, Daniel unexpectedly learned that he had mortgaged the house and received 165,000 euros. It turned out that he and his wife had both signed the loan documents, though he had no idea about it. Daniel loved that house, had built it with his own hands, and would never have mortgaged it. In fact, he didn't know about the loan because he had never signed the papers at the notary. Someone else had impersonated him and signed the documents. The investigation would never be able to determine who went to the notary with Manuela that day. In any case, it was a shock for Daniel, which led to serious disagreements with his wife. He no longer trusted her and became increasingly convinced that he should get a divorce. It should be noted that Daniel normally would not have discovered the loan because Manuela herself regularly made the monthly payments. But in 2008, she had fallen down the stairs, was hospitalized, and missed a payment, prompting the bank to contact her husband. In addition, when the investigators reviewed the couple's bank accounts, they saw that about a month and a half before Daniel's death, someone had withdrawn money from his accounts and transferred it to the couple's joint account, after which the funds ended up in Manuela's personal accounts. Considering that Daniel died soon afterward, this appeared highly suspicious. In addition, the police discovered that both Daniel and the house he had built were insured. This meant that in the event of his death, the house would remain in the family, and his wife would inherit 3/4 of it. Combined with a life insurance policy worth 234,000 euros, this amounted to a substantial sum that Manuela would receive after her husband's death. Thus, the investigation focused on a single suspect. However, the police had no direct evidence linking her to the murder. If the detectives hoped to obtain a confession from Manuela, they needed to learn as much as possible about her life and past. As they delved into her history, one surprise after another awaited them. Life had not been kind to Manuela. 3 of her lovers had died, and according to the official version, the cause was sheer, incredible misfortune. Manuela Gonzalez was born on October 14, 1960, into a family of Spanish descent in the town of Lemure, south of Grenoble. It was a mining town, and her father worked as a miner. Manuela had 7 siblings, and they were a very close-knit family. She was a cheerful, pleasant, and very beautiful girl. While still in high school, in 1978, she married Gilbert Martoya. The couple had a daughter, Virginie. However, her young husband soon began experiencing health problems. In 1983, he even spent 3 months in the hospital. He had ingested Temesta, lorazepam, and at the time, everyone assumed he had intentionally overdosed. But when the police investigating Daniel's murder spoke with him, he explained that he had suffered from stomach issues, had undergone surgery, and had been gradually recovering. He had no reason to take such a large quantity of the medication, nor did he intend to end his life. This raised the natural question of how the drug had entered his system. However, it was clear that Gilbert did not want to fully disclose all the facts, perhaps trying to protect his ex-wife or not wanting it to affect their daughter. In any case, after parting ways with her first husband, Manuela did not remain alone for long. The young divorced woman was left with a child in her care and struggled to make ends meet, maintaining several paid relationships. One of her clients was a jeweler, Michel Garcia. However, in October 1984, the man suddenly fell into a coma and was admitted to the emergency room after drinking tea prepared by Manuela. This happened because she had generously spiked it with the same lorazepam. While the man was in a coma, Manuela stole a check worth 80,000 francs from him. However, the man recovered and realized he had been robbed. He did not hesitate to go to the police. Manuela changed her statements several times but eventually admitted to stealing the check. She claimed that she had only given Michel a sleeping pill. However, laboratory analysis revealed the same powerful drug, lorazepam. Manuela admitted that she had financial problems and that this was the only solution she found to get the money. The court sentenced her to 2 years of suspended imprisonment. At this point, one might have expected the young woman to reconsider her life choices. But Manuela had other plans. She entered into a new relationship with Francois Colasso, the owner of a bar in a small town near Villarbonneau. Francois was a simple, hard-working, and friendly man who treated his girlfriend well, but his fate would not spare him. On April 29, 1989, Manuela found him in the garage of their home. The man had died from inhaling car exhaust. The autopsy revealed that he had ingested lorazepam beforehand. After several months of investigation, the police concluded that the man had chosen to inhale the exhaust gases himself. The case was closed, despite protests from his family, who did not believe the version of his voluntary death. Very soon after Francois's death, Manuela began seeing Thierry Lechevalier. On April 6, 1991, neighbors noticed smoke coming from his house. They called the firefighters, who went upstairs and found the source of the smoke. It was coming from a closet. Inside the closet lay Thierry, completely covered in smoldering newspapers. The man was dead. Once again, the toxicology report revealed that he had taken lorazepam. The police launched an investigation because the circumstances of his death were more than suspicious. But Manuela claimed that Thierry had undoubtedly chosen this way to say goodbye to life himself. Yet who would lock themselves in a closet and set newspapers on fire? Moreover, it was very strange that on the day of his death, the man had taken out a loan of 4,000 euros and handed the money to his girlfriend, Manuela, to help her fulfill her dream of opening a driving school. Convinced that Thierry had been murdered, the detectives arrested Manuela. However, she was soon released thanks to the testimony of a witness who claimed that she could not have killed Thierry because she had been with him. The witness was her lover, Daniel Cano. The investigation continued for another couple of years, but ultimately the case was closed. Thus, nearly all the men who decided to share their lives with Manuela met a very grim fate. In the best-case scenario, they suffered serious poisoning and hospitalization. In the worst-case scenario, it was terrifying even to imagine. Manuela always claimed that she was simply unlucky. Considering that several of her lovers had died, there were 2 fires, a strange attachment of all her men to lorazepam, and large sums of cash that Manuela invariably received. The investigators did not believe her, yet they were in no hurry to arrest her. Instead, they began to wiretap her phone and the phones of all her family members. They discovered that on October 31st at 8:05 a.m., Manuela's sister Francesca called their parents to report Daniel's death. But here's the catch. At that time, the police had only discovered the burned-out car. They had not yet determined who it belonged to, nor had they had a chance to speak with Manuela. So how did his wife already know that she had become a widow? This is where she slipped up over such a small detail. A loving daughter had called her family far too quickly. While the police were gathering information, a year and a half passed. Finally, on March 23, 2010, investigators decided to interrogate Manuela. She did not even consider confessing to anything. But despite her protests of innocence, she was charged with attempted murder and the murder of her husband. The police could not bring charges related to the cases of her other victims, whom they believed she had killed, because those cases had been closed or discontinued and could not be reopened. The trial took place in April 2014 at the Palais de Justice in Grenoble. Fortunately for the prosecution, and unfortunately for Manuela's defense, the prosecutor was allowed to list all the other crimes she was suspected of. Otherwise, with almost no evidence, proving her guilt would have been difficult. But her past painted a very different picture, and the defendant was found guilty. The prosecutor demanded a 25-year prison sentence for Manuela Cano, but she was sentenced to 30 years. Of course, she immediately filed an appeal. Her lawyers petitioned for her release while awaiting the second trial, and their request was granted. On September 21, 2015, Manuela was released. The new trial began on May 23, 2016, and it did not come without surprises. Manuela appeared accompanied by her family. She had dyed her hair blonde. As the media venomously noted, she probably wanted to soften associations with the Black Widow nickname she had been given. She and her lawyer took a desperate step. They requested the exhumation of Daniel's mother, claiming that he had left a note in her coffin, stating that he would soon join her, hinting that he intended to follow his mother in death. The court refused the exhumation order. Firstly, after so many years, the note, if it existed, would likely have deteriorated and its words would be unreadable. Secondly, even if he had written something like, "See you in heaven," it would have had no legal bearing. The court again sentenced Manuela to 30 years in prison. She filed appeals to the Court of Cassation and the European Court of Human Rights, both of which were unsuccessful. She still maintains her innocence regarding the death of her husband and the death of each of her husbands and lovers.
When a former Los Angeles prosecutor clashed with a burglar who broke into his home, he had no idea how complex and strange the outcome of the case would be. And when it was all over, he desperately tried to understand why it happened. The only answer he could see: diet pills were the cause of the shocking crime. It was a quiet September evening in 1996. Former Los Angeles prosecutor, 50-year-old Jose Garza, was spending time with his beloved wife, Nicole, when she suddenly craved some diet ice cream. She asked her husband to fetch it from the garage, where it was stored in the freezer. Jose readily went to get the ice cream. It was almost 11 p.m. The house in Sylmar, a suburb of Los Angeles where the couple lived with their 3 young children, was mostly enveloped in darkness, as was the street around it. Suddenly, the cozy silence was broken by the family's dogs barking. Jose stopped halfway, alarmed by the sharp and insistent barking. Could someone be trying to break into the house? He decided to check, but first he retrieved a pistol from a locked cabinet, one of the many in his collection. Jose cautiously opened the garage door, slowly reached for the light switch. At that very moment, 3 gunshots rang out. The flashes of light that illuminated the garage allowed Jose to catch a glimpse of the shooter. To his horror, he saw a figure that reminded him of a ninja with dark clothing, a wig, glasses, and a mask covering the face. The person had started shooting without any warning. Fortunately, the bullets missed their mark. Jose, holding his pistol, returned fire. He fired just once, but that was enough. The dark figure clutched their stomach and collapsed to the floor. Jose didn't risk approaching the person on the ground, nor did he remove the mask from their face. After all, what difference did it make what the person looked like? Let the police handle that. The important thing was that he and his family were safe, or so he thought at that moment. Therefore, Jose rushed to the phone to call the police. When the police arrived, they asked the neighbors to watch over the couple's 3 young children while they took Jose Garza and his 32-year-old wife Nicole to the station to give their statements. Meanwhile, officers examined the crime scene. The man who had attacked Jose was still lying curled up on the garage floor between the boiler and the freezer, with blood flowing from his abdomen. Without removing his mask, glasses, or wig, they transported him to the hospital, while the forensic team began collecting evidence. They found no signs of robbery or forced entry into the home. Even the garage door was closed, so how did he get inside? However, the forensic team did discover the assailant's revolver and 2 bullet marks on the door leading from the kitchen to the garage. It was clear that Jose had miraculously escaped death. Additionally, on the garage floor, the forensic team found a bracelet with keys to a Ford Bronco, which did not belong to anyone in the Garza family. At the station, the husband and wife were questioned separately. This was done because spouses tend to speak for each other, which can interfere with the interview process. Jose was very active during his questioning. He immediately sought to secure the detectives' agreement that he had not exceeded the acceptable limits of self-defense. As a former prosecutor, although he dealt primarily with minor offenses, he had successfully prosecuted criminals and gang members, potentially making enemies along the way. Aware of this, he was prepared to act accordingly. He collected firearms and knew how to use them. However, he was now anxious about whether the police would agree that he had the right to return fire after the intruder shot at him 3 times. The conversation with Nicole, however, had a completely different tone. Despite what had happened in her home and the fact that she was at the police station, she was completely relaxed. She calmly recounted that before the incident, she and her husband were enjoying each other's company in the bedroom. After some intimate moments, she craved something sweet and asked Jose to bring her some diet ice cream. It was stored in the garage, so Jose went to fetch it. Suddenly, she heard gunshots, and her husband rushed back to call the police. He then took their children, who were also frightened by the loud noises, to their room. While detectives were interviewing the couple, unexpected news arrived from the hospital. It turned out that the burglar who had shot at Jose 3 times was a woman. She had no identification on her, and her identity had not yet been established. But just the fact that the shooter was female immediately shifted the investigation in a new direction. The detectives suddenly had a lot of new questions. Could this have been one of Jose's 2 ex-wives? Or perhaps a lover? Jose confidently dismissed all these suggestions. Nicole also couldn't name any woman who would want her husband dead. At one point, a detective was asked to step out of the interrogation room for a moment. When he returned, his first question to Nicole was, "Tell us about your relationship with your sister." This was an incredible twist because the armed ninja turned out to be Nicole's own sister, Lynette LaFontaine Trujillo. When Jose was informed of the identity of the person who attacked him, he was genuinely surprised. He stated that he wasn't very close to his wife's sister and didn't understand why this fragile woman, a mother of 4, would shoot at him. But here's the strange thing. When detectives began questioning Nicole about her sister, she didn't even bat an eye. In other words, suddenly and out of nowhere, police investigators start pressing her about a family member, and she didn't find that odd at all. But why did Lynette try to kill Jose? Was she jealous of her sister's family? Did she intend to kill just the man, or was she planning to go upstairs to harm her sister and nieces and nephews too? The couple couldn't answer these questions, so they were allowed to go home. Moreover, despite Lynette's critical condition, she had regained consciousness, and detectives decided to try to question her directly. They rushed to the hospital. Lynette, of course, couldn't speak, but she could potentially write down answers in a notebook. As soon as the police entered her room, Lynette gestured as if she was writing with a pen on paper. But when given a notebook, she only wrote 2 words, "Diet Cola," and then fell back asleep. They tried to find a clue in the woman's life. Friends who knew the red-haired sisters Nicole and Lynette well recalled that the girls were very popular and well-liked by everyone. Despite their popularity, the sisters were completely different. Lynette was as creative and artistic as her younger sister was intelligent and serious. Nicole found studying incredibly easy and completed her homework without any difficulty. As they grew older, the differences between them became even more pronounced. Nicole achieved success in life, earning a higher education and becoming a divorce attorney. A beautiful, well-off woman, she created a wonderful family with a respected prosecutor. This was her second marriage. Her sister could only envy her. Lynette, on the other hand, struggled to find purpose in life. From an early age, she dealt with a series of problems. She lacked self-confidence and struggled to accept herself as she was, leading to bulimia. This was followed by a dependency on illegal substances and disappointments in love. She married Miguel Trujillo and had 3 sons, but their relationship didn't stand the test of time. During the divorce, Nicole represented her sister. In 1994, Lynette became a mother again. However, like her previous 3 children, this son also stayed with his father. After this relationship ended, Lynette moved back into her parents' house. At 34 years old, she was living with her parents and working double shifts as a waitress. But she missed her children terribly and would see them whenever she had the chance. However, life's misfortunes don't automatically turn someone into a killer. Lynette must have had a serious motive to commit such a horrific crime. The answer came with the discovery of the Ford Bronco, which belonged to Lynette. The car was found early in the morning, parked a couple of blocks away from the Garza family home. The key found in the garage matched the lock. Inside the vehicle, officers discovered a bag filled with damp, torn pieces of paper. The officers thought the papers were incriminating enough to be destroyed, yet important enough to be kept. This case was turning into a puzzle, literally. It took the team quite a bit of time to piece together the text on the sheets, but when the fragments started to come together, they realized they held the key to solving the case. The torn paper pieces were once letters. There was no signature or date, but as the fragments were reassembled, it became clear that these were letters sent to Lynette. The letters contained detailed instructions on how to kill Jose. Specific recommendations were given. Wear a wig but no makeup. Bring gloves. Get a manicure to shorten your nails. Gunshots are very loud. Don't scream, don't be late for work, and act normal the next day. The author of the letters expertly manipulated Lynette's emotions, convincing her to commit this dreadful crime. You're mentally strong enough to do this and forget about it. You're stronger than you think. A minute and a half of terror and your life will change completely. Thanks to these letters, it became clear that someone had convinced Lynette to commit the crime, and that someone was Nicole, as the letters also mentioned, Mom. Investigators were able to uncover that Nicole had long been complaining to her sister about her marriage. She convinced Lynette that Jose was abusive, that he humiliated her and mistreated her in intimate ways. Nicole insisted that everyone would be better off if he simply disappeared. In one of the letters, she wrote to Lynette, promising that once it was all over, she would take care of her sister and her children. Nicole assured Lynette that she would help her get the breast surgery she had always wanted, find her a better job, and assist her in gaining custody of her children. In her desperation, Lynette, a mother of 4 who saw no light at the end of the tunnel in her life, agreed to help her sister. Nicole was arrested on September 27th, just 1 day after the shooting. Jose couldn't believe what the investigators were telling him. He quickly hired the best lawyer for his wife and visited her regularly in jail. Jose insisted that despite the nearly 20-year age difference and the fact that they had only been married for a few years, he and his wife were the perfect couple and deeply in love. The best evidence of this, he said, was their 3 children. A few days later, Lynette passed away in the hospital. She never regained consciousness and was unable to tell her side of the story. Her 4 young children were now motherless. Lynette's youngest son was told that his mother was working a lot and couldn't see him. The middle son was convinced that she had abandoned them, and the eldest, a 10-year-old boy, called other family members twice a day to make sure they hadn't disappeared like his mother. How can you explain to a young child that his mother is dead, killed by his uncle, and that his aunt is in jail? Lynette's relatives wondered. On October 8, 1996, Nicole was officially charged with the murder of her sister, conspiracy, and attempted premeditated murder. Although she didn't pull the trigger, from a legal standpoint, Nicole created the situation that led to her sister's death. On Tuesday, September 24th, the day before the attack, she gave Lynette a revolver, the keys to her house, and instructions printed from a computer. Everything was supposed to go smoothly, but that night, Jose also took a gun. Not only did he manage to avoid being shot, but he also hit the attacker. Nicole hadn't anticipated this outcome. As she wrote to her sister, the first bullet would surely kill her husband. But if something went wrong, Lynette was supposed to fire 2 more shots into his back. However, detectives found it odd that Nicole gave her sister a revolver from her husband's collection, one of the least effective weapons for the task at hand. One might think Nicole handed her the first revolver she found, but she knew firearms well and was aware of what she was doing. Detectives believe she had no intention of helping Lynette get back on her feet. In fact, they think she never intended to leave her accomplice, even if it was her own sister alive. According to their theory, she wanted Jose and Lynette to shoot each other, and she would then finish off whoever survived. Without the letters, Nicole might have gotten away with everything, but those fragments of paper tightly connected her to the crime. Consequently, she pleaded guilty to involuntary manslaughter and attempted murder, thereby avoiding the most severe punishment for her crimes, life imprisonment without parole. In January 1997, she was sentenced to 15 years to life in prison. However, she never explained her motive. She constantly complained to her sister about financial and personal problems, alleging that Jose kept her and the children on a tight leash and controlled everything. But even if this were true, the first thing that should have come to an unhappy wife's mind was divorce, not murder. However, if her husband died, she would receive his insurance payout, pension as a former Los Angeles prosecutor, all the real estate, and all of Jose's savings. Naturally, she didn't want to get her hands dirty, so she convinced a family member to commit the murder for her. This is why even Nicole's relatives couldn't forgive her, because the murderer not only took away her sister's children's mother, but also her own. Due to one reckless decision, 7 children were left without their mothers. Nicole was released in 2012. She remarried and moved to Arizona with her husband. She lives an ordinary life as if nothing ever happened and has no contact with her now adult children. Nicole manipulated her sister and her husband. The judge remarked that this case resembled Franz Kafka's works in its darkness and plot twists. For Jose, the whole ordeal seemed surreal. He had always supported his wife and blamed everything on the diet pills Nicole had been taking for 5 months before the attack. She had lost 60 pounds, but he believed that the pills had changed not only her appearance, but also her behavior. Jose was convinced that, under normal circumstances, she would never have conceived a plan to kill him. After his wife's arrest and charges, Jose went through an extremely difficult time. At first, he couldn't even think about divorce and kept his wedding ring on for a long time. Despite his children being young, they remember him crying in the bedroom or bathroom, trying to stay strong only for their sake. Nicole didn't kill Jose as she intended, but she did kill an important part of him.